So, good afternoon. I really want to start by thanking Sophie Rice and Tom Thrash for organizing this panel. So, I'm going to tell a lie about Tom first to start off with. So, Tom calls me up and he says, Scott, I would like you to be on this panel. I've known Tom a long time in this industry. He said the panel is going to be on the topic of cough. Call off the impact factor.
Okay, I can leave.
Wait a minute, it gets better. I said, Tom, cough, call off the impactor. We can't do that. That spells quaff, not cough. Researchers make decisions about where to publish, even about what research to pursue, in part based on their understanding of how they'll be evaluated and what the metrics will be for evaluation. And certainly important decisions are made about tenure and promotion and peer recognition based on metrics. And so this panel is going to deal with some of those topics, including why the impact factor is still so dominant, how that impact factor and other metrics are changing. Is the article level metric an important aspect we should look at? We've heard today about the fact that the preprint may become the new normal, and how does the citation of the preprint factor in? So I'm very pleased to welcome the panel. We're going to have a 30-minute discussion and leave 15 minutes for questions. I have immediately on my right Carl Leek, who's a life sciences librarian at George Mason University. To Carl's right, we have Mariana Garcia, who's the acting executive director of the Web of Science from Clairvit Analytics. Deputy now, thank you. Some of you will know Adrian Stanley from his role as past president of SSP, and you may need to stand up, Adrian. His current role is managing director of publishers at Digital Science. And we're also very fortunate to have researcher Jesse France from the Naval Research Laboratory. Jesse's also served as a topical editor on one of the OSA journals. And I'm Scott Deneen from the Optical Society. I'll be moderating, not really answering a lot of the questions, but if publisher issues come up, I could likely speak to those. So as you can imagine, we had an interesting time planning what we were going to talk about in just 30 minutes on this topic. And we've come up with 3 questions. We're going to try to talk around these 3 questions. And the first I'm going to read out, and Mariana has agreed to field the first question. So what is the scope of scholarly indexes and metrics that do influence a researcher's reputation or a journal's reputation? What are the metrics and indices that we should be talking about today on this panel?
So I suppose this is working. It's working, okay. So I did not stand up. I'm not leaving, but I'm not here to defend the impact factor, obviously not. So what I want to say is that out of the 60 years that the Web of Science has been in existence, I dedicated 20 of those years from my own career. So and I worked with in various iterations under ISI, Thomson, and now Clarivate, always in the same capacity, evaluating journals. So and making those hard decisions, what is worthy enough of being covered and what would be most useful for our users. So if your journal is not covered yet or was rejected, you can blame it on me or my team. But anyway, joke aside, it's a very hard mission, and the mission changed over the years. Obviously, when I started 20 years ago, that pyramid of trust that starts with the honest researcher, the author, the editor-in-chief of the journal, the publisher of the journal, and so on, was still strong. It was standing and had very few crumbling bricks in it. Things have changed, as you know, with not only with information overload, with emergence of the electronic journals, but things have changed with integrity as well. So obviously we had to change with it. So our mission changed in that now we don't only evaluate and are very careful to select the best, but we also have to be very careful that we provide a service that is trustworthy and useful, like you said, to our users, be it the researcher, the research manager, the funder, or whoever the user is. And I think maybe you wanted to address that, Adrian, too, that it really all depends on, if we talk about metrics, who those users are. And obviously the metrics will be used differently, sometimes misused, like the impact factor often is. And I think one of the questions is that, right? How not to use metrics like the impact factor. So in any case, I wanted to frame the discussion and maybe explain very briefly or really jumpstart the discussion in saying that as the Web of Science provides two components, two very important ones. One is the bibliographic, the content component, and obviously this is what we're selecting for. So my team has been selecting journals for coverage in the Web of Science. We do not select journals for the journal citation report specifically. That's a different team. So in order to provide a trustworthy and meaningful metric, obviously you need the data for that. And we provide that. So as the only real citation database that selects in-house objectively journals or resources, because we select proceedings and books as well, we think that we provide that base for a meaningful metric. And it's not only the impact factor. As you know, the Web of Science is not only an index of content, it provides information on citations for authors, funding, and many other metrics. So an index in that respect is not simply a list, even though you would be surprised, many of our customers just call in or send in and just ask for it. I want an impact factor. But they don't realize that we just don't provide an impact factor offhand. First, the journal has to meet the quality criteria. So I think this is what we're going to talk about. What are those important metrics? When do they become meaningful? How we should not use them? Or what is needed? And how can the community in general offer suggestions and give us ideas on what is needed? Because the session is called New Directions, I want to take this opportunity to say that we've grown with the demands of the market. We are in a transition now, not only leadership, we're in the transition of developing a new platform for the evaluation process. We have grown the team. There are new features offered both in the Web of Science and in JCR and Insights. So there are new directions, and there is hope, I think. Also with other providers, obviously. We can learn from each other. And there was a question about preprints. I don't know if there is time to address that one, but we also revived the Institute for Scientific Information, and there are experts there and analysts, and they're looking into all these new developments, including preprints.
Thank you. Adrian, this might be a good portion for you to take up. Other than the services that Mariana's mentioned, how would you round out the scope of metrics and indexes that you think are important, or influential, or emerging?
Yeah, thanks everybody. And obviously, talking from my perspective of digital science and a product we develop, Dimensions, which really isn't an apples for apples, and we try not to be. We created a linked research knowledge network that connects publications, citations, grants, clinical trials, policy documents, patents, to do a sort of broader evaluation of the whole research sort of community and network. So when we're thinking about what metrics are, we're looking at a very different, bigger picture for science and scientists. And our sort of policy is sort of index more and collate more and make the links, but let the community decide what's important, what's not important, where. So trends like seeing, data citations, making data available, the broader impact of alternative metrics for things like the ref in the UK, are all very different measures that people are using, and we try to sort of make the tools and data available for other people to do that assessment.
Is ResearchGate a place where researchers go to find important metrics? How far does that go in terms of the reach of?
It's a good question. I mean, Altmetric tracks all the readers and saves from Mendeley so it's Mendeley an index, and I suppose the same way. Where are people reading, digesting, using, finding downloads?
Jesse, when we were having our planning calls for the meeting, you made some observations about the researchers you work with and what metrics they're aware of.
Right. I'm speaking, by the way, from two perspectives. As Scott mentioned, I have been an editor for several publications from the OSA, the Optical Society. So I've been doing that for 6 years, and I'm continuing to do it. And I'm also a scientist who's publishing, and I see how people use metrics to select where to publish, and also how it affects kind of people's careers and promotions and that kind of thing. And from where I stand, I think there's a very limited understanding of metrics. Most people rely on impact factor at the journal level and H-index at the author level, and it's very much limited to that. And I know some people at this meeting are involved in developing metrics that are much more informative and much more useful. But among the scientists that I work with, it's very much limited in terms of what's used. And I think the education level, the awareness level of scientists is very low, and it's probably a little bit. I work at a government lab. It's probably better in academia, but even there, people I speak with in academia, I think their understanding of metrics and their use of them is very limited compared to where the field is and what has been developed in this industry.
I want to say something. I agree that it's misunderstood, that it's poorly known. So our approach now, I mentioned the new workflow, and probably I brought some pamphlets there to explain the extent of our coverage in the index and everything that's offered. The point that I want to make is that it's not just that number alone. It's not just the metrics, because everything that we cover in the core, at least in the Web of Science, this is how we do it, is carefully and consistently curated and continuously curated. What we want to make known to the community, to the researchers, and maybe to research managers and all the other personas that are involved in the publishing landscape, is that just being covered because that material was curated and decided upon the value and the integrity of it should be a goal, an aspirational goal in itself. I know it's very hard to sell that to the authors, but some of them get it. And a lot of the major publishers that we have talked to get it. Because we have now the option of, before there was the only option, either you're covered or not. You either get an impact factor or not. Right now, we have this multidisciplinary collection that we started in 2015. It has a poorly chosen name, and we probably will change that name. It's called the Emerging Sources Citation Index. That's where we put in journals. And I think when we discussed it with the panel before, there was the question, what do we do with the journals that really don't have an impact factor? And there might be an author who is a very, probably not a Nobel Prize winner, but has a very important contribution in a very narrow field, I don't know, birds from Antarctica or whatever. And such a journal would have very little chance of having the citation performance so that it eventually gets an impact factor, and we recognize that. And that's why we want to stress the fact that just being curated and being accepted into the Web of Science in this quality collection, the way that we call it in-house, the Emerging Sources Citation, is an aspirational goal in itself. yes, there is no number attached to it. There is no impact factor, let's put it this way, attached to it. But that author will see his work in the Web of Science. He will be able, and the publisher will be able to tell the author, and the EIC will be able to say, send us material because your journal is actually covered in the Web of Science. So that is a stamp of approval in itself. It's not a metric, but it is a stamp of approval and value because it's been curated. And it's not just a result of an algorithm.
So Carl, in your role at George Mason University, I know you deal with an extensive array of data to help drive decisions. I assume that might be what you want to lead with.
Right. And I can also piggyback on the fact that we also play a role in trying to work with faculty to see some of these limitations that there are with the impact factor. And what we're finding is that within the library field, there's a disparity between the expertise in bibliometrics overall among librarians and those who can provide a service. So a lot of libraries, they have librarians who know about the impact factor, but they don't provide a service. And that can vary depending on the support you get from your overall library team. But what we try to do is try to win small battles because we know that the researchers and faculty depend a lot on the impact factor, and that might be all they see, or the H index. But what we try to do is try to widen that gap by talking about some more relative metrics as opposed to absolute ones, like, for example, percentile rankings, where we can use those to say, all right, outside of the impact factor, this might be, even though it's not the end-all, be-all, a journal ranking in the top percentile of a group of journals might give us some inroads into making those connections with faculty and helping them see there are other metrics outside the impact factor. But we know that we don't have a lot of time and real estate with faculty because of their busy schedules and ours. So we just try to pinpoint, based on what their goals are, just small things over time that we can introduce them so that they know that there are other things out there. And over time, hopefully, our goal is that they embrace some of these concepts.
Thank you. That brings us to the next question. It was a good lead into it. There are journal-level metrics, there are article-level metrics. We wanted to maybe talk a little bit about the merits of journal versus article-level metrics. Certainly there are high-impact papers that are published in journals that don't have high impact factors. Maybe Mariana or Jesse, you might want to take the lead on this one. Or
Thanks. So the journal I was previously an editor for, Applied Optics, I think it's about halfway down in the JCR rankings in its category in optics. It has an impact factor of around 2. So it was somewhat lower. But there were occasionally articles in there that were kind of foundational for their fields and got really high, a lot of citations, and are, in this somewhat lower, or moderate, I should say, impact factor journal, but they're articles that everybody in the field knows about. And there are also another kind of article that I think that maybe metrics don't capture as much, that are articles that get seen by the right people and maybe don't get referenced, and the articles referencing them don't even get a lot of references, but they're in a field where they provide a key piece of information, and these are very important articles, and they're sitting in a journal that does not have a very high impact factor, yet they're still significant importance in the field. And I think, and I don't know that there is a way for metrics to capture that kind of importance. But I see, I'm a strong believer that there's a place for journals with very strong metrics and with weaker metrics. I don't think a journal has to have a very high impact factor to mean that doesn't necessarily, a high impact factor doesn't reflect the total value of a journal. And I think some people are aware of that, but I also think there's a tendency to overlook these journals that have a somewhat lower impact factor, even though they can be important.
I totally agree. and the way that we evaluate journals, we take that into account, actually, because impact, aside from, I'm a linguist by profession, so words are important to me. Impact does not only mean impact factor, okay? So we're talking here about various impacts. We're talking about the intellectual impact, the impact for the career of the researcher, the social impact, the economic impact, and so on, of everything that's published. So you probably are aware that we have a new workflow now that is much more transparent, and you will see where I'm going with this. So we have 24 quality criteria, and that if a journal meets those 24 quality criteria, it qualifies to be covered in the Web of Science. 4 of the criteria, the last stage of the evaluation, we call impact criteria, and those 4 are the estimated impact factor. Obviously, we use it as any other person does. We calculate the estimated impact factor based on our data. We look at the citation performance, not the citation activity. Also the activity, obviously, because some people have activity, but they're not performing at the level that is expected for, I don't know, the top quartile of the respective category. We look at the citation performance of the editorial board. But, and this is the answer to your question, ultimately, because it is a team of experts in their area, and most of them know their collection very well, and they know the field, and they're looking for hot topics and for important things, and about those impacts that I mentioned before. Not only the intellectual impact of creating networks of authors and institutions and so on, but the other impacts, the impact for science in general, the importance for the society, for the well-being of society, for, I don't know, promotions, economic impact, or very focused and important topics. So the last criterion in that decision, the editorial decision, is content relevance. So obviously, some journal will always be in the bottom quartile, and there will be journals at the very bottom. What we want to do is find now, and I mentioned the Institute for Scientific Information, the think tank. We have specialists there who are working now on benchmarks to help us make that decision, so that it's not just a gut feeling of the editor. I know that this topic is very rare, important, focused, niche, and new, and consequently, even though the journal is not well cited and it doesn't have a high impact factor, I still want it to be there in the main collection and have, I don't know, an impact factor. However, we don't think that a journal where the trend shows that over the last 15 years of its publication, it had an impact factor of 0.02, meaning it was cited 1 year 0 times and the next year 2 times and so on. Such a journal obviously doesn't have impact in every sense of the word impact. And such a journal, even though it meets the quality criteria, there's nothing wrong with it. Obviously, it should not belong in the elite collection of the journals. And then such a journal can move then in the general population of the quality collection, but it's not an elite journal. So, in other words, if we have to choose between an international journal on a global topic in biotechnology that ranks at the bottom, and the journal in a very rare niche field or hot topic or whatever, obviously the journal with the one important article that really breaks the glass ceiling of the impact factor will be covered. However, the other one will not be, and most likely will be moved in the collection. And that's another principle that we've been following over the last 60 years. The collections are not static. They are dynamic. They're moving. We want the collection to be stable, but we also want to reflect the actual performance of the journal.
Yes.
Just to add one point on, Scott, at the individual article metric level, there are new measures like the field citation ratios that then normalize within fields. So those are being used, I see, more sort of for individual assessment in normalizing in different ways by the bibliometricians and people like that.
Is that consistent with what you're saying as well, Carl?
Yes. I would say those are very important, and I can talk about George Mason specifically here, because what our mission was, we have 7 institutes at George Mason that focus on various disciplines, and what we found is that a lot of times the administrators of these centers wanted to know metrics about their researchers there, but the problem was these centers are multidisciplinary. So what we had to do was to use metrics that normalized, that were in context with the field that they studied in, so that it would be balanced, because otherwise you will have sort of a lopsided kind of image of one researcher at the bottom and one who looked to be more prolific in their research, whereas within their field, this one researcher was probably just as relevant, if not more than someone else. So that's very relevant in terms of what we do, and as librarians, how we have to keep things in context when we communicate with researchers and administrators as well.
So given how much organic growth has brought us to the point where we are now, it's understandable things are messy, but what if we were to start from scratch? What if we had the opportunity to create a fair and effective system of scholarly metrics for evaluation? Where would we start? I wonder if everyone could have a chance in the last about 9 minutes we have to weigh in on this question. Jesse, you're at the end of the table. It might be nice to go down in order.
It's a good question. I don't know where to start with this. I think the other panelists might have more perspective of how to do that than I do. One thing that I will point out is that what I think is important from my perspective is that whatever metrics we use are used in context, and I think I've seen it's really a mixed bag when people are using, say, an author's H index to determine whether they should get promotion or get a particular grant. I think that there is a real mix of using the metric properly and kind of putting it into context and having a nuanced understanding of what the metric really means. And on the other hand, I've seen some egregious misuse of metrics where I know a group within a government lab, I won't say which, but it's a US government lab, where they have a rigid formula for promotions where part of what the formula is the number of articles every article you get points for the H index of the impact factor of the journal you publish it in, and it's divided among the authors, and it's divided up by the number of authors, and so authors are kicked off of publications, can contribute. It's an absurd misuse of I think what metrics really tell you. And I guess in answer to the question, I don't really know how I would restructure or design a new metric, but I would say that what I think is most important from my perspective is that metrics they give you a lot of useful information, but I think they have to be put into a bigger picture and understood in kind of the larger context. So yeah, that's my take on it.
Yeah, I was actually joking with a colleague who does this, Mike Taylor, who's I think on the screen somewhere, and we're trying to figure out, obviously there's pockets of people trying to do exciting research and look at these areas of challenges, and it can differ in different disciplines. But we thought the only way you could really do this was probably get all the right stakeholders in one room together, lock them there for about a year, not let them out.
The white smoke.
Wait for the white smoke.
Feed them a little bit, but yeah, wait for the white smoke. But it really is, I think, about a broader set of metrics, but how they're being used by all the different stakeholders, normalized, open, available in different ways is if I was going to do this again. But
I think we need experts like Carl to help make sure things are fair and normalized. But Mariana, maybe your final words on this question.
You probably know what I will say. No, I agree 100% that the main thing is that it's used in context. And just to mention two of the misuses that we see on a daily basis. There's a misconception in some markets, and they're not poorly informed markets, where they think that we actually assign the impact factor the way that the teacher gives a mark on a paper. One of the misconceptions. And the other outrageous thing that I've seen, one of them, is some institution or organization in Germany who decided some sort of calculation where they say, okay, half of the research published in Germany is in German and the rest is in English. So what we will do is we will take the impact factor, divide it by 2 or multiply it by 2, I don't even know. And that will be the impact factor of a German journal. So misuse is ridiculous. It should be looked at in context, definitely. And I agree with Adrian as well that it should be a combination of factors, not just one, several. And like I said already, one of the directions in the Web of Science group is to look at these different dimensions that we can add to the impact factor. So the answer is, if there were no impact factor, I would invent it. And because it's very simple and easy to use, provided that it's used correctly. And I think it's here to stay, but it has to be improved.
And very quickly, I will say as a librarian that in terms of from the standpoint of organizing information, if we can do it all over again, it would be great if there was more of a partnership with people like the people on this panel and librarians and faculty members and researchers, and also accrediting boards within their disciplines to look at, try to understand what goals are, what research goals are based on the disciplines, because that also drives what kind of metrics would apply to that discipline. So if there's a way to get more of a intercommunication among all these different professions and disciplines to have people understand if this is where your discipline is going with it at a university or wherever or within a discipline, then these metrics apply best for what you want to do. Because a lot of times we try to learn these different skill sets and then we want to go apply them, but they don't really match to what the outputs are. So I think if we could start over, then that would be what I would like to see, is just more of a more fluid communication among these different areas so that people can see, we do this kind of research, we want these kind of outputs, so these metrics work best for us. So that by the time it gets within a discipline, it might be too late when they're using it the wrong way, and all of a sudden it becomes a part of practice and accepted, and it's hard to correct when it gets to that level.
Well, yes, Adrian.
Just a quick shout out for something we're actually doing within SSP too, but we talk here about the sort of administration, research and publishers, but we also should be thinking what funders want out of research they fund. Yep. We have a funder task force that is looking at things like that. So,
yeah, I think SSP certainly has a role in helping people coordinate and communicate much better. Look, we've barely scratched the surface on this topic, but please thank our panelists. We're ready to take questions for the next 15 minutes. But we can thank them.
I guess I'll start off with a question from our virtual audience, Mike Taylor. Hi, Mike. His question is, how do the panelists make a judgment between an article in a journal with a big impact factor but no citations versus an article in a journal without an impact factor but no citations? How do you tell an author they published in the wrong journal?
If you want to go first, Carl. Thanks, Mike.
I hate to go first just to say that I don't know, but in that case, I'm not sure. Just because, and that gets to the point of gleaning reputation just because the journal has a high impact factor. And I think that goes back to what we were talking about earlier, where the zero doesn't necessarily mean zero, and there's more that has to come into play as to what does that particular piece of work mean within that discipline. And there are other ways to figure that out as opposed to zero citations. So I'm not sure. I don't think I would ever tell someone they published in the wrong journal, so I can't touch that from there. Yeah. Anyone else?
I mean, I think just going on are there other metrics aside that if it has, 20,000 downloads and a huge Altmetric score, that has some value, even if it doesn't have a citation, right? So, yeah. Mike, do you actually have the answer for that question?
What other questions do you have for the panelists this afternoon?
Hi, Ann Stone, TBI Communications, and also on the organizing committee for Transforming Research with Mike Taylor, so a follow-up to that. For Carl, how many times are you asked within your role to support promotion and tenure evaluations, and what kind of opportunities does that afford you to reevaluate metrics that it could be useful? And does that enable you to have those conversations about what matters to your discipline?
Yeah, so unfortunately, we don't get a lot of inquiries based for that reason, because a lot of times we get asked to do something without knowing what the reason is when people ask for these metrics. What I can say is that we do see it's sort of anecdotal, and I don't mean this to be statistical or something that's a guaranteed number, but we do find that faculty coming up for tenure and promotion, I would say the first time around, that first promotion, we are getting asked for support for metrics for those reasons. And that's coming primarily from as far as we know, from the health sciences area, and I'm in the life sciences, but we do have a lot of people in the health sciences asking for these kind of metrics. And the reason why it is because the current dean of our College of Health and Human Services came from the NIH, and that's where, a lot of the bibliometrics, a lot of things that we've learned came from the NIH with the work that Chris Belcher's doing. So when she came, Dr. Lewis came as dean of the new college, she pushed that on the faculty. So a lot of our inquiries outside of that school, we don't know the reason for why they're doing it, but we're doing it, and that we leverage that time to try to tell them about the limitations of some of those metrics that they use. Right.
Scott, I have a comment. Just going back to that first question of how would you do things differently, and thinking about you as an audience of publishers, one thing, it's not necessarily metrics or impact factor related, but I would take a leaf out of Ann Michael's book and have more people who've done data science courses and understand data and how to analyze and tell the stories from that within your sort of staff as publishers, because I can only see data and metrics becoming more and more important, whichever form they are. So that's one thing I would do differently, sort of thing, if I'm looking at the future.
Yeah, that topic came up earlier today, that decisions between librarians and publishers and all other parties are going to need to be more data-driven, and we're going to need to get on the same page about what is fair and reasonable in terms of those types of data exchanges, for sure. There was another notion that came up in our rehearsal calls that maybe I'll throw at the group. Jesse, you mentioned that the notion of the article itself is changing. We've talked about the life cycle of the article, maybe including the preprint, and I know in physics publishing that's been the normal for a long time, but there's also the data set that's published with the article, and just all kinds of other ways that the article is not what it used to be. Are there any thoughts on how that may affect metrics, or what might influence the new, better system of metrics.
Well, I don't envy you all in having to develop metrics for the situation because, yeah, as Scott said, we discussed this a little bit, that the whole notion of what an article is changing because the preprint in physics we have archive, and I know there's similar things in other fields. And then the preprint in the journal, and then the final published article itself. It's not this this clear single publication event of what an article is. And I know that different indices, the different metrics handle this different ways, and it seems, and from my perspective, it's kind of a mess right now. I mean, you see citations to the archive preprint, and then citations to the actual article, and I think that's hard to track, and I think probably a big challenge in this field.
I don't know if it's known that Web of Science also has a data citation index, so we obviously collect that information. We have a dedicated team to do that. And talking about an article and data sets, yes, sometimes they are cited themselves, but oftentimes they are included in a data paper, and we created an article type, I believe it was 2 years ago. And the accepted format of a data paper doesn't have to follow the format of a research article. So it usually includes information about the source, the data set, and so on. So some of the citations are captured there.
Mariana, who initiates that format? Who decides an article has that format?
We have a team of bibliometricians who decide the journal profile. So the journal profile is analyzed, and then, for instance, I don't know, in a new journal, they will decide. Also, at the recommendation, obviously, of the editor-in-chief and so on. So we collaborate with them, and it's decided which articles are called articles, reviews, meta-analysis, whatever. So it depends on the article type. But we have the new article type, obviously citable, included in the calculations data paper.
And just on the point on preprints, I think Crossref were definitely doing some work on how to map preprints to articles, but it's the same. I think it's a community discussion again, like where do you go from preprints or conference posters and other types of early publications when that work, how close is that to the finished article? And
and Jesse alluded to the accepted manuscript, which I think wasn't part of the new normal we talked about before, but needs to be included in that whole chain, including how the DOIs are minted and how things are connected together. So certainly being advocates of, agreeing on proper citation procedures and then enforcing them in our different roles is one thing we all really can do that is a practical way to help with metrics collection and fairness. Are there any other questions from the group?
This is my own personal question for Carl specifically. How much does the impact factor of a journal determine your decision whether or not to include that journal title in your library collection?
So that it's not something that's used consistently, but we do use it a lot upon request. And the point at which we use that for collections, I'll speak for myself and as the subject specialist for the life sciences, is when we have an ask for a publication that is very expensive. The faculty is trying to make the case for it. I will use the impact factor as just one way to include that when I have to justify that purchase. But we don't have a systematic approach to using that across the board for collections, but that's just one way that I do use that.
I have a question for you, Carl.
Oh, okay.
Am I allowed to ask?
You are allowed to ask a question, please.
Thanks, Sophie, for asking that, because I wanted also to find out from Carl and maybe from the audience, when an author submits an article, is he more worried that he will submit to the wrong journal because it's not a trusted journal? even if they know that they will have a lot of chances to be for the article to be accepted, or are they more driven by a white list of trusted sources, the way we offer it with the Web of Science?
So, I'll take this time to say that I don't speak for George Mason in this particular instance. This is my personal opinion. Unfortunately, the question it hardly comes up in terms of when faculty publish. What we do find is that the faculty, at times they have to publish somewhere, and their frustration or their anxiety is not based around either of those criteria, unfortunately. It's based upon, for example, when there's a cost assessed for them to publish, they ask if the library supports funding for them to pay that cost. But for us, we don't get a lot. Now, I'll tell you where it does happen is at the student level, graduate students and undergraduate students alike, where they have assignments or projects where they have to look at journal impact factors for potential places to publish as they prepare their graduate projects. So we do help them in that instance to get a sense of the journal impact factor and the important journals in their field, and we use it as a segue to introduce other things such as the eigenfactor and other things that might help limitations with that, to try to get a full scope of what makes this a so-called good place to publish as I prepare my project for publication.
Okay, please thank our panel one more time. I believe we have a short break next. Thank you. Thanks to all of you for participating. Really enjoyed it.
Yeah, I wish we did. Yeah. No, now, I'll tell you.
Excellent job, everyone. Thank you so much. Again, a round of applause for this fantastic topic and panel. We have a few minutes before our next discussion, so please feel free to take 10, 15 minutes, and then we'll start our next panel.